Welcome to Al Rawiya, the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So Nadine, you're a human rights lawyer and a researcher on refugee policy and issues. First of all, can you tell us a bit about your background in refugee policy and research?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a human rights lawyer, as you said, and I was working on other issues before. But as of 2019, end of 2019, I moved to Lebanon and I started working on research that has to do with Palestinian and Syrian refugees, especially over the course of 2020 to 2022. I was working mainly on Syrian refugees with Alif, a human rights organization here, and just kind of monitoring and documenting any abuses of human rights, protection issues, and basically updates about the refugee situation in Lebanon as they came about. And currently, I'm working on an academic research project with 3 lovely professors from the EU, different parts of the EU. And yeah, our goal is to basically do some comparative analysis between refugee policy in the EU and refugee policy in Lebanon, and we're also going to look at Jordan. And how they influence one another and how they maybe inspire policies in each other's countries or practices, and what does this mean then for refugees?
Okay, that's very interesting and very needed, I think, in the region. So I wanted us to talk about the recent deportations that took place in Lebanon in April of 2023, where we had a large amount of Syrian refugees who were rounded up, arbitrarily arrested from different areas in Lebanon, and then they were deported, and amongst these deportees were children. So I wanted us to talk a bit more about that, look at how it happened, who perpetuated this entire thing, and I guess ask the question of why.
Yeah. Yes, the events that happened this April, and I'm not sure even if it's still ongoing. I'm sure that it's quieted down quite a bit. But as of July 2023, Human Rights Watch had reported that 1,800 people had been forcibly deported under this strange mechanism that was borne by the Lebanese army, because we've had return plans in the past and returns have been facilitated in the past, but it was always under the jurisdiction of general security. So this was the first time in Lebanon's history that we've seen the army take up deportation actions. It was very much not under their jurisdiction, and the rules that were set by the GSO, although they were not for the GSO to set, so this is also a very interesting issue, but the rules that were set by the GSO, which would allow someone who had a UNHCR registration or a residency permit, whether expired or current, to stay, were not respected by the army. So from what I understand, there's no documentation of any person who had a legitimate or a current legal residency who was deported. However, people who had expired residencies were deported, and people who had UNHCR certificates of registration were also deported. It was very strange. It was preceded by a campaign of massive hate speech and scapegoating, which we've also had in Lebanon quite a bit in the past. But, it was clear that this was very much a concerted effort, that it seemed like politicians were on the same page about this messaging. And I don't think we've seen such a concerted campaign before in the past as well on that side of things. It doesn't help that there's already some tensions between the Syrian refugee community and Lebanese. I think, for me, my opinion on it is it stems back to the Syrian occupation and the civil war, and the fact that we've never had any proper truth and reconciliation after the fact. So people have not had the chance to heal their wounds, whether they were caused by different factions in the war or the role that the Syrian regime played in the war. But people don't seem to understand that these same people that are fleeing regime persecution are, they're fleeing the same persecution that many Lebanese suffered during the Syrian occupation here. So there isn't that connection.
Yeah.
And that just allows people to jump aboard the sort of hate train and the scapegoating campaign and really believe what they're taking in, because it aligns with their biases and the issues that they have not resolved yet, you know. So yes, a lot of people 1,800 people were deported. This is more than in any past deportation campaign, and this is all in the span of about 3-4 months. Mm-hmm. So that was quite shocking. And the way in which they were deported, the raids on people's houses, the trauma it left behind, the stories we heard, like the little girl in Alay who came home to find her family had been deported. Like these traumas will stick with these people for a long time, and that's for the fortunate ones who have not faced risks upon returning. Many we heard have come back. Many we heard were actually delivered right to smugglers. Oh. They were delivered to the Syrian forces. They were saying 4th Division of the Syrian forces. And then we've heard stories that people were basically immediately directed to human traffickers who could take them back, bring them back to Lebanon. Huh. So it's very strange in that way. It shows that maybe the regime doesn't even want this many returns. And yet Lebanon is putting this forward as if it's the best thing for everyone, as if it's the best thing for refugees. There's nothing to be feared anymore in Syria, and the regime is really opening the way for them and forgiving all pasts. Yeah. And this is not accurate whatsoever.
Yeah, there are a lot of myths, I guess, that are popping up in these conversations and conversations about refugees in general. And I remember once the deportations were happening, there was talk about how, you know, كانوا عم ياخدوا اللاجئين واللاجئات وعم بيحطوهم على البوردر كأنه ما في يعني ما عم بيبين إنه في direct communication with the Syrian regime. Mm-hmm. And then by happenstance, the Lebanese authorities leave and suddenly the Syrian authorities show up. And so it's very interesting how these, I guess we can call them covert operations, are taking place with a regime that, you know, half of the politicians stand against and then the others stand with. And so seeing the dynamics of how the government decides to deal with, you know, people who are quite controversial in the political sphere in Lebanon, regardless, you know, in the entire world as well. So that's interesting as well. Yeah. And so we heard that a lot of these deportees also were disappeared once they got to Syria. So some of them lost contact with the family members who were here. Some of them had or they were separated from their families once or upon arrival. Mm-hmm. So all in all, it's a very it's a case of clear injustice. It's not only injustice, you know, injustice is a really small word to describe what Absolutely. Has happened, you know. Because at the end of the day, even though many people in the authorities like to claim that these deportations were voluntary, but they weren't voluntary at all, you know. Voluntary isn't when someone comes and picks you up while you're walking on the street in Burj Hamoud and suddenly next thing you know, you're on your way to a country that you have not been to in, you know, over 11 years since the crisis, since not the crisis, the war had started. Yeah. And people seem to forget the implications of going back to a country that maybe you can say that there isn't as much, you know, war and fighting going on, but the aftermath of the war is not something to be played with or reckoned with.
Absolutely. And we forget that you don't have to be a refugee from 2011 to qualify for asylum or to qualify for refugee status, because, you know, time goes along and things change, and someone who might not have been in danger in 2011 might be in danger in 2023. So there was never supposed to be any, like, the Refugee Convention doesn't envision some kind of time frame or, you know, that war has to be widespread throughout the entire country for refugee status to be applicable. Refugee status or asylum is applicable to anyone who's fleeing persecution in their country of origin. So yeah, I mean, somebody could have, you know, come of age in Syria over the past 12 years and maybe discovered that they're queer and are being persecuted, or maybe suddenly decided to speak out against the regime and are being persecuted. These people have the right to seek asylum elsewhere. So yeah, it doesn't make sense to confine it to a certain date and to declare that, oh, people who are coming now are just coming for financial reasons because, the war is pretty much over. That's not true. And we've seen current events happening in Syria, like with the protests in Sweden and everything that's been going on. There have been ongoing attacks in certain areas. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have documented cases where people, upon returning or as they are returning, they're harassed or even abused by soldiers at checkpoints. So this shows that you cannot guarantee the safety of anyone going back. And yes, like you said, there were, I think, at least 4 detentions. And I think MENA Rights Group has submitted complaints about 2 people who were disappeared as part of these return campaigns. So yes, it is extremely dangerous. And you touched on the issue of voluntariness. The way voluntariness is defined by the humanitarian discourse around this issue is that it's voluntary where it's informed. So the people actually need to know what they are returning to. If you don't know what is awaiting for you, if you don't know if you're facing a potential case against you, persecution, maybe your home is destroyed, you have nothing to return to, this is not an informed return. So it can't therefore be voluntary because you don't have all the information to make a voluntary decision. So even this, that word is used quite loosely by not only our government, I think, but other regimes as well in the EU, for example. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so we can say that these deportations violated many international laws. So, for example, the principle of non-refoulement, where you're not if it isn't voluntary, and if unless you're 100% sure that the person that's going back is sure that they want to go back and is going back to a safe environment, it can't happen. It violates international law. But we saw this happen. We saw this happen in April. We've seen it before, and we'll probably continue to see it as long as there isn't accountability over these types of mechanisms in the country or by the people who are running these different agencies in the country as well.
Absolutely. And you touched on the issue of how there was this excuse made of people they're just being dropped off at the border, and then somehow the Syrian forces know to come and pick them up. This is not the first, we've heard many stories about such kind of cooperation. Even when I was at Alif, I think it was in 2021, there was a case where six Syrians were arrested at the Syrian embassy by Lebanese intelligence forces. So they had been called to pick up their passports, and Lebanese intelligence was waiting for them to arrest them. And if it wasn't for the very active campaign that many of us took part in from different NGOs, and I'm sure there was a lot of diplomatic negotiations happening behind the scenes, it's very possible that these people who were from Daraa and who were activists would have been returned and faced very grave persecution.
And so this is a point that's to be made, how repressive regimes, no matter which country it is, they'll always be able to find common ground between each other in order to get their ultimate goals or interests done. So, for example, we saw this with the activist in Lebanon, the Egyptian activist, Mukka, who was in Lebanon, who was arrested by Lebanese authorities, even though he's wanted or persecuted by the Egyptian authorities. So we see how these regimes, they hold each other up in these situations, no matter if on a grander scale their goals are different. But at the end of the day, when it comes to oppressing or keeping your people at bay, they'll do whatever it takes. And one of the ways that the Lebanese government does this, or the Lebanese political sphere or ruling class, we can say, is through the facilitation of various myths against Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Not only Syrian as well as Palestinian refugees as well. But since we're, kind of looking at the deportations and everything, it makes me think of the various things that, or the various arguments that people have over why refugees shouldn't be in Lebanon, or over why they don't deserve being here, or they should go back. So the public discourse surrounding them is very,
absolutely,
heavy.
I think we've always had some level of I think in the early days of the war, there seemed to be a more warm reception for refugees and more understanding and sympathy. And then as time went on and the number increased, there was a lot of, stoking fears about demographic change, about Tautin. The Lebanese government is very much against any suggestion of nationalizing other, foreign nationals in Lebanon. And I think that this is actually, part of the whole, the scapegoating and the misinformation to try to, create similar fears among the population and sympathy for these sort of policy beliefs. Because most, I hear Lebanese officials often saying, they, meaning the EU and these other diplomats and countries, want us to nationalize refugees here. And they don't say that. The EU is very much aware that this is a sensitive spot for
not
Lebanon.
Say that in public,
I don't know I can't speak to what's being said behind closed doors.
Exactly.
But, in their public-facing reports, they even reiterate that this is not for the purpose of nationalizing or creating permanent residence of refugees. So, this is one piece of misinformation that is extremely rampant. Tales about how much money Syrians get from different aid agencies is just ridiculous. We've heard numbers in the hundreds, in the upper hundreds, like up to 800. And in fact, only recently was the ceiling raised by UNHCR for how much a family that is eligible. So first you have to be a family that is eligible.
Exactly.
And then you might qualify for $125 a month. That's it.
For the entire family.
Yes.
Which is,
And this may be supplemented by, a bit of resources, maybe from World Food Program or another NGO, but it's not in the hundreds of dollars, that's for sure. So, this is another big piece of misinformation. The idea that Syrians are taking Lebanese jobs because they take lower wages. Well, this is resolved through policy by having a minimum wage and monitoring that this minimum wage is being followed. It's not by prohibiting people from working. So,
and at the end of the day, when it comes to this discourse, who is really lowering these wages? Who's paying these low wages? It's these companies, it's these employers that are, actually exploiting workers, whether it be Syrians or Lebanese or Palestinians, by paying these low amounts.
Yeah.
And then another thing that comes behind when we go back to the point of each family being eligible, not all families are eligible, like you said, because not all of them are registered. So at the moment, there's... I believe there's a recent estimate on the UNHCR website that talks that there are around 1.5 million refugees in Lebanon. But I understand that this number might be a little off. What are your thoughts?
I'm not sure that UNHCR, maybe at one point because I believe in 2015, UNHCR had 1,150,000 registered refugees. And so maybe with the Palestinian population of refugees, you could estimate that it was 1,500,000. But at that point, the Lebanese government issued a moratorium on registering refugees. And since then, many have voluntarily returned to Syria. And so the latest number is by UNHCR is 817,000. And the LPDC, a few years back, the Lebanese Palestinian Dialogue Committee, did a survey of Palestinian households in Lebanon, and they found that there was about 250,000 Palestinian, or it might have been lower than that as well, Palestinian refugees. So that doesn't add up to even more than 1 million. So I'm not really sure if this is based on estimates of how many refugees might be present in the country that don't include, that are not registered with UNHCR. But it's not clear to us where exactly these numbers are coming from or how accurate they are, which I think is a huge disadvantage, actually, because how are we supposed to know how much need we need to fulfill in the country, how much funding is needed for protection and other services if we don't know the number of refugees that are present here? So
100%. And it leaves a lot of space for myths and for lack of better word or term, propaganda that can arise against refugees and can ignite this hate speech that exists against them. When in reality, you know, we have to talk about how the living situation in Lebanon is not is again. To put it in simple terms, is less than ideal, you know. A lot of individuals, Syrian refugees, are living in conditions that are a simple violation of human rights. We've seen so many cases of a tent burning down or the individual sleeping in it, unfortunately dying and passing away because they had to turn a lamp or a candle on, and then they had carbon monoxide poisoning.
Wow.
You know. And I remember there was I'm not sure when it happened specifically, but there was the burning of an entire camp in Ba'a. And so I don't think this sounds like a proper living space or proper living conditions for Syrian individuals, you know. So I think this is something that's very important that needs to be noted by everyone, that, you know, it's not an easy situation to live in. And
these factors you're talking about, we call them in the humanitarian sphere push factors. And this is another reason why the return, we can't say that returns are 100% voluntary, because if you're facing, you know, harassment, fears, a lack of work opportunities, a lack of dignified living, you can barely make ends meet and support your family, these are all push factors. These are all factors that would make anyone question whether they should remain where they are or risk the chance that something could happen to them, but maybe they'll have more resources by returning. So again, that would not then be a fully voluntary decision, because there's elements that are pushing you to make this decision. So yeah, I mean, these are all issues that are very much need to be addressed. A lot of funding has come into Lebanon in order, and it's clearly stated, especially by EU policymakers, it's clearly stated that this funding is not only to benefit Syrians, it's to benefit all of the population that is vulnerable. And so this funding is going to hospitals, to education, and of course, a good chunk of funding is going to providing humanitarian services and protection. And maybe less funding would be needed for these services if, you know, refugees had more rights in this country and could rely on those rights.
Okay, so there's another thing that went around. I remember this very heated topic in Lebanon and abroad in diasporic spaces and so on about the elections that took place, the presidential elections in Syria, and how apparently many Syrians here voted for Bashar al-Assad, and they should all go back to their country.
Yeah.
Very, very, very interesting way of putting it. They should go back to their country. It reminds me of, you know, Donald Trump. So, so what are your thoughts on this narrative that was being pushed by people, and they should go back because they voted?
I mean, it was again, it's a lot of misinformation. I'm sure there are Syrians in Lebanon who would not even consider themselves refugees, who might be here for business or other purposes, who actually did go and vote because that's what they wanted to do. But we had a lot of reports at the time I was with Aleph. We had a lot of reports from activists and organizers on the ground saying that people were being forced onto buses at gunpoint. There were incidences of abuse. And then they were forced to go and vote in the elections. So they were attacked on the way to go vote. So they were getting attacked on both sides, from those who were forcing them to go vote, who are sympathetic to the regime, and from those who are like, why are you voting? You're refugees. I feel so bad, honestly. Like, when I picture being a Syrian in Lebanon, how it must feel to feel like people are against you wherever you go, that insecurity that you must feel, the vulnerability, and all because you're trying to protect yourself and your family. It must be so painful. Like, as people who lived in the diaspora, I'm sure like many Arabs in the diaspora have experienced some instances of discrimination or racism. And this is the Syrian experience in Lebanon basically on a daily basis. So, you know, for those people who are in the diaspora who are saying, go home, I mean, if you're gonna say that, you yourself should come home.
Exactly.
Frankly.
And that's يعني, and they're talking about this, and again, we can't say that everyone living in the diaspora is living their best life and everything, but a lot of them live in countries that have social protection systems for immigrants and nationals alike and kaza and all that. يعني فينا بلش وضل نحكي من اليوم لبكرة. بس يعني here refugees have close to nothing. Like what we're going to talk about, the small amounts of money that registered refugees get vis-a-vis the unregistered refugees who don't have access to this money and are forced to go into informal labor routes and so on and get exploited. And so what that leads to is many of them deciding that they can't live in this country anymore, no matter what it takes. Which brings me to my next point of the shipwreck that happened in 2022, in April 2022, off of the coast of Tripoli. You know, things like these, they show that the situation was so dire, they had to put their lives at risk in the sea. And arguably one of the most dangerous ways to travel on mechanisms, on ships that aren't even properly equipped.
And we see an increase in these since 2019, when the economic collapse in Lebanon started. We saw such a rise in cases of people trying to cross international waters to make it to other safe zones, and we've seen so many tragedies around this, and Tripoli is no exception. And I think that it's interesting, you know, based on the research that we're doing as part of this academic study, to note that this practice has been employed in the EU for quite a long time, the practice of pushing people who are at sea so that they're not able to enter search and rescue zones of those countries, and that they're pushed to then go to another country such as Turkey or back to Libya. And many of these attempts at pushing them back at sea have resulted in catastrophic deaths. And then we saw the Lebanese army trying their hand at one of these tactics. I'm not sure if this is something that had been tried before, but I found the similarity between these practices and the fact that they, from the army side, they say it was an accident. Activists and lawyers are saying that it was intentional, that they hit the boat. But regardless, whatever it was, whether accidental or not, the idea of using force or violence to push people back to Lebanon, where did it come from? So I think that this is exactly what our research is looking at. How do practices and policies in different countries influence one another, and what does that mean for refugee rights? And refugees in general are very much a disenfranchised population, because until they reach somewhere and they receive a status, they have no means to fight for their rights. I mean, you're not going to see refugees in Lebanon protesting and putting themselves, on display like that. Exactly. And making themselves even more vulnerable. Very rare that any of them seek legal recourse. We've had instances where refugees have faced grave abuse by Lebanese individuals who could go on to reoffend and abuse other people, but they're too afraid to go to the police and file a complaint. And for good reason. It's likely that their complaint will not be taken seriously, So it has an effect on the refugee population. It has an effect also on the rest of the population. Yeah. And it has huge implications for human rights globally. And what does this say about when countries that are human rights leaders are engaging in these pushback practices and externalization efforts, what kind of message does that give to countries like Lebanon, where already human rights, like we're fighting tooth and nail for our human rights to be recognized and protected? Yeah.
No, and this brings us into the next topic of conversation of, Lebanon as a host country arguably has committed great violations, immense violations against disenfranchised communities such as Syrian and Palestinian refugees who are currently residing in Lebanon. But also they don't exist, Lebanon as a host state doesn't exist in vacuum. And it does get affected by all these external policies that take place, whether it be in the EU, in these, closed chambers, open chambers, conferences. So what can you tell us about that in terms of first of all, the decisions that took place in Lebanon as host states about the existence of Syrian refugees within the borders, and then how they get affected by policies that are that come from the EU.
Mm-hmm. So a colleague and I wrote sort of an article showing our preliminary findings from our research project for Tahrir Institute. And what was very interesting and striking to me was we actually saw politicians publicly speaking about EU policy. Mm-hmm. So first of all, this entire campaign took place at a critical moment, which is before the Brussels conference. And we often see deportations campaigns taking place before the Brussels conference. And the Brussels conference is an annual conference to garner aid for Syrian refugees in various refugee hosting countries. Not in the EU, but in regional hosting countries that actually need the extra support. And yeah, so it seems like there's, more intolerance and more discussion of returning refugees and actual efforts to do so when it becomes closer to the Brussels conference, where Lebanon can then lobby for more funding for its different services and protection schemes. I believe 1.8 billion in EU funding has been received by Lebanon since 2011.
Wow.
And like I said before, a lot of this has been for common purposes, for health, for education, that benefits everybody. So, this is one aspect of, it seems a bit clear, and this is part of the reason why we're doing our study, because we want to try to make more concrete connections between, is this happening specifically to put pressure on the participants at Brussels? Is this happening because you truly want the EU to take on more of its responsibility, which is legitimate, because the Refugee Convention envisioned a situation where border countries to a conflict or a crisis would have a larger number of refugees and may not be able to handle the influx of refugees. This is exactly, to some extent the case in countries like Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, where already the systems aren't that great, especially in Lebanon, to then be able to handle this large influx of people, to ensure that rule of law is followed, to ensure that rights are respected. And so the idea was that there would be burden sharing between countries. It seems like the EU envisions burden sharing as funding, whereas I think what's needed is much more a sharing in resettlement of refugees and providing safe pathways for them to the EU so that they can actually make their asylum claims there.
And then when it comes to, I guess, from the perspective of Lebanon as a host country, looking at it from like a holistic perspective, or looking at it in the grand scheme of things, how do you see Lebanon through its decisions, the decisions that it puts out or applies? How do you see them? I guess, can you list out the violations that come to mind on top of your head in terms of the decisions that they've put out?
The different decisions around refugees?
Yes.
So we have initially it it seems to have, Lebanon has not signed the Refugee Convention. But as you mentioned, we are obligated by the principle of non-refoulement. We've also ratified the Convention Against Torture, which also prohibits refoulement. Refoulement is when you send someone back to a country where they face threat of harm or persecution. So definitely we've done that. But I think a lot of other nations have done that as well.
Yeah.
I think, you know, what we're seeing right now in Turkey, we're seeing a large number also of forced deportations to Syria, large numbers. And yet there are pushbacks from the EU to Turkey. So you're technically pushing people back to a country where they would face chain refoulement. So you're participating in that crime. In Lebanon's case, it seems like initially when the situation started, they wanted to give the appearance or take the path of being very welcoming. And then it started to erode over time. And yeah, slowly became, by 2015, there was, I would say, na'ze, like people were startled by this 1,500,000 refugee number. And so they requested that UNHCR stop registering people. They also they declared that only those who had a UNHCR certificate or who had entered before January 1st, 2015 would be eligible for refugee status. This decision was actually overturned in 2018 by the State Council, which is Lebanon's administrative court, because they held that it's the Council of Ministers that has the right to determine entry and exit requirements for foreigners and not the GSO. And yet the GSO went on to make other decisions about refugee returns. So in 2019, they then kind of expanded the previous 2015 rule and said anyone who entered before April 24, 2019 is eligible, can remain in the country, or if they have UNHCR registration. But yeah, I mean, it's very strange how, both with the situation of the recent deportations, the army deciding that this is under their purview, that they can go ahead and deport people, and the GSO completely ignoring a court decision and going ahead to make decisions about entry and exit requirements for foreigners is very strange. And it's part of the huge chaos that is Lebanon, and the fact that people take on different roles arbitrarily, depending on what's most beneficial. We've seen this happen also with the port blast and the attempts at accountability that have followed it. So yeah, it's not unique to the situation of refugees, but generally it's a state, Lebanon is a country that needs significant reforms. We haven't had a president for how long? All of these factors are part of the situation. They all feed into this sort of distraction from attempts at distracting people from what's going on and the real rot that we have in our system, rather than, and bringing their attention to vulnerable people who cannot really stand up for themselves, and creating distraction in that way.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, what we're seeing with refugees is happening with many, like you said, it's happening in many different sectors in the country, whether it be against, let's say, the LGBTQ community, women, other disenfranchised communities, the domestic migrant workers. And because there is no, system for accountability, who's going to say something? Who's going to do something? Who's going to protect these individuals? So at the end of the day, I think, as a concluding note, it's so important for people to see how the ruling class is using refugees and using all these other disenfranchised communities as scapegoats to what's truly happening. So what can happen to refugees today by the Lebanese authorities can happen to any Lebanese person tomorrow. You say one word on social media and you're gone.
Absolutely.
So there's a necessity for people here to understand, for Lebanese people to understand that the struggle that they're going through can be shared and felt by refugees who are going through a struggle as well, through a different struggle. We can't claim that all these struggles are very similar, but they converge in many places.
100%,
so,
yep.
Once people realize that they're being scapegoated, that refugees are being scapegoated, and you shouldn't be hating your refugee neighbor. You shouldn't be, directing your anger towards them because you can't find a job. It's at how the policies are or are not in place. We do not have policies in place.
Exactly.
It's like all hell breaks loose,
Yeah, it's a sort of becoming a dog, more and more so becoming a dog-eat-dog kind of country. It's not like we were ever an oasis of human rights and rule of law, but I think there was a point in time where Lebanon was climbing and attempting to reach those standards, and it just seems like we've gone so far backwards, and so many people are facing abuses of their rights, like you just mentioned, and it's creating a chilling effect on the entire community. All civil society and activists and the different actors that care about these issues are finding it harder to discuss and even harder to find clear information about what's really going on, because there's so much opacity around all of these policy decisions, what inspires them. So yeah, and I think that part of the solution is really for those countries that have influence over Lebanon and have provided critical funding to Lebanon in its time of need, to take a stand and say, we need to have more oversight over how this money is being spent. We need to, have more insight, like from NGOs, and we need to direct funding more towards NGOs as well. We need more accountability all around if we're going to continue supporting and funding services and programs and in Lebanon to such an extent. And they need to also set the example of continuing to be human rights leaders, and they really need to fix up some of these practices and start leading the way for better rights for refugees. Yeah.
I hope we'll be able to see this in the coming years, decades,
yeah, I hope so.
Century. But that being said, thank you so much for coming here and talking with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and to everyone watching this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow our YouTube channel and other socials.
Highly recommend.